extend a welcome to any visitors we have here. We're glad you're here with us. And it's always wonderful to gather with God's people. I'm encouraged by your presence. And this is the last week I'm going to do this. For y'all that have been here the past few weeks, remember these questions are for tonight. The spoilers for the sermon if you read them beforehand. But please come to our small groups. The discussions have been really great. I got to attend 2 last week, and the discussions are going really well. They're really fruitful discussions for our church going forward as we look toward writing a mission statement for our church, for getting some direction and guidance for our church. Where does God want us to work? If you remember 2 weeks ago, we set before us 2 key questions for our church. The question of identity, who are you? And the question of purpose, what are you doing here? And this week, beginning with last week and this week, we're going to continue our focus on this first question, the question of identity. Who are we as the Cross Timbers Church of Christ? Now, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, when we first posed these 2 questions, the text I gave for the question of identity was from Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5, known in Hebrew as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Now, there's a lot here in the Shema. In my mind, it contains a rubric for discerning our identity. And over the next few weeks, we're going to look at individual aspects of the Shema to guide our discussions and discernment going forward. So after the opening line in the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. In verse 5, we get the command. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Now this verse has traditionally been understood in 2 ways. Now most Christians hear this verse today and think, this means, each of these are referring to different aspects of my being. And so the verse means to love God with your entire being. And while that's an absolutely true interpretation, it actually misses some of the power of the verse. Early Jewish interpreters, early Christian interpreters, understood each of the commands here, love God with all your heart, soul, and might, to be complementary but distinct ways of loving God. Each command is specifying a specific way of loving God. So the command, love God with all your heart, is a way to love God. Love God with all your soul is a way to love God. And love God with all your might is a way, different ways to love God. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at each of these aspects. Because as each of these are ways of loving God, they also point to distinct aspects of our identity that we can use to love God. So over the next few weeks, we're going to look at each of these one after the other to see what they have for our discernment of our identity and what can we learn from them to help us learn to love God in that way. What can we learn about ourselves from them as well? So, as you might have seen from the side, this week we're looking at the first one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. Now, before we look at the text that's going to help us explore this morning, there's a couple of things we need to clarify here that will be for this week and for the following weeks to come. So I'm going to test your memories. But first, when the Deuteronomy says love, it's not talking about an emotion. Love in the Bible is not concerned with emotions or feelings. Whether when the author here says love, he's not talking about feelings. For the author and throughout most of the Bible, love here is about covenantal love, covenantal loyalty. It means steadfast devotion. It means that you will act toward a person a certain way despite not having any feelings for them. This is why when God is said to be angry with Israel, he's still said to love them. Because it's not about how God feels toward Israel. It's about how God reacts in relation to them. There's a lot to be said about marriage here as well, I think. So love in the Bible is not concerned with emotions or feelings. It's about covenantal love, covenantal obedience. Now, when we see the command, love God with all your heart, we may be thinking, well, this is commanding us to have an emotion about God, because we tend to associate the heart with emotions or feelings, this emotional love that our culture likes to prize. But again, for the Hebrew audience, heart, like love, is not concerned with feelings or emotions. God's relationship with humanity is not dependent upon God or humanity's feelings. But their heart in the Hebrew is concerned with wills, your human will, your impulses, your desires, your inclinations. So when it says to love God with all your heart, it means that it's not that he wants us to have warm feelings toward God. It means that he wants us to have an undivided commitment to God. Absolute commitment and focus and purpose. So heart in the Hebrew is not concerned with feelings. It's concerned with your human will, your impulses, your desires. All these should be directed at God. So to love God with all your heart means that all your faculties of will, of impulse, desire are committed to God. Their sole focus is on God. Said another way, it means that we should love God with our passions. The passions God has given us. We direct all our passions and energies to ways that serve, honor, and glorify God. For example, and to use the passions differ from person to person, from community to community. So my way of loving God may not look like your way of loving God. Our community's way of loving God may not look like Graham Street's way of loving God. Passions can differ from community to community. Just for example, God has placed, to use the language, has placed it upon my heart the passion to preach and teach. And so for me to love God with all my heart means that I pursue those two passions that God has given me with everything I have, to love God in that way. As for another example for community, a church I worked in West Springfield, Massachusetts, God had placed it upon their heart. He had given them the passion to teach English as a second language as a form of outreach and service to their community. And so they pursued a language outreach program called Friends Speak. And this is how they pursue God. They're pursuing that with everything they have by God's grace, and they've been successful at it. And so loving God with all your heart means loving God with our passions. Loving God with our passions, each of us have been given a passion to push us towards God. And so loving God with all our heart means to pursue that with all we have. And so when Jews and first century Christians daily make this confession of the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, they're daily committing to being people who love God with all their heart, who pursue God with undivided commitment and purpose and loyalty, who pursue God with their passions. Yet when Christianity started spreading to the Greek world, this idea didn't translate too well. This idea of absolute commitment, of undivided devotion and loyalty, it didn't translate well to the Greek world. Greek culture prized leisure and pleasure. Greek culture, to put it in modern terms, had a go with the flow mentality. Pursue whatever interests you at the time until something new comes along. Sounds a lot like a culture we know, doesn't it? So Paul is this first century Jew who daily makes this confession of the Shema, this confession of absolute commitment to God as part of his identity. He has to figure out how to translate this to this Greek culture. And he does so in an interesting way, in a way that I think will help us as 21st century Christians understand what this commitment and confession means, and help us get an idea of what Paul thought it meant and what it looks like carried out. So our passage this morning comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, if you want to turn there. 1 Corinthians 9, 23 through 27. And as always, before reading our passage, we've got to set some context. So, first century Corinth is a city that exemplifies Greek culture. The 1 Corinthians Christians, which Paul are writing to, are products of their culture. This is a city that prizes leisure and pleasure. And now, if you've read the letter to Corinthians before, then you know that the Corinthians, they have a bunch of problems. They have a lot of issues that Paul is trying to address in these letters. Now, at the core of a lot of these problems is this Greek culture, this mentality of go with the flow, pursue whatever strikes your fancy, this idea of leisure. And this is at the core, that's the core of all their problems. And just for example, right before our passage that we're going to read, Paul has been talking to Corinthians who, though they're Christians, are still participating in the idol cults of Corinth. And these Corinthians Christians apparently see no problem with participating in idol cults while also still being Christian. Paul hears of this, and he's, of course, not completely okay with this. If I had to summarize Paul's tone in this letter, throughout this letter, is, hey guys, what you doing? Come on, get with the program. So imagine this Paul, this first century Jew who daily makes this confession to love God with all his heart, to have this complete undivided commitment to God, and he sees these Gentile Christians who have no concept of this. They pursue whatever they want, this go-with-the-flow mentality. And they see no problem calling themselves Christianing, but still worshiping and participating in idol cults. And so Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 is in many ways seeking to correct this mindset, seeking to correct this mentality. Paul's trying to get the Corinthians to understand what it means to love God with all their heart, what it means to have an absolutely undivided commitment toward God. So first, right before our passage in 9:14 through 22, he uses himself as an example. He says, look at me, when I preach the gospel, that's the passion God has given me, to preach the good news. And I do it with all I have. He talks about how he directs all these different efforts to preaching the gospel, to the pursuit of this one passion God has given him for his kingdom. And finally, to drive the point home, he uses a metaphor from Greek culture to help the Corinthians understand this idea from the Shema, to help the Corinthians understand what it means to love God with all their heart. Let's read this morning, 1 Corinthians 9, 23 through 27. Give ear to the word of God. But I do all this on account of the good news, in order that I might be a sharer in it. Do you all not know that in the stadium all the runners indeed run, but only one receives the laurel? Run in such a way that you may take hold of it. But everyone who strives exercises self-control in all things. Therefore, they on the one hand strive for a wreath that is perishable, but we an imperishable one. Therefore, I run in such a way not as one who is aimless, and I box in such a way not as one who beats the air. But I discipline my body and subjugate it, so that after preaching to others, I may not somehow become disqualified. So in order for Paul to get the Corinthians to understand this idea of loving God with all their heart, this absolute commitment to God, he uses an image they would have been extremely familiar with living in first century Corinth. He uses the image of the Greek games. Now, some of y'all that know me already are thinking, Wayne's about to talk to us about sports? If you want to get me interested in sports, give a little history with it. So this is the sports I know what I'm talking about. But Paul used the image of the Greek games. And while not as big as the ancient Olympic Games, every 2 years, the city of Corinth hosted what is known as the Isthmian Games. The name Isthmian comes from the stretch of land that Corinth is located on, the Isthmus of Corinth, that connected the two islands of Greece. And you can see on the map that where the games were hosted is not too far from the city of Corinth. It's only a few miles. So every 2 years, the Corinthians host the Isthmian Games. And this is the second largest event in the Greek world. People come from all over the Greek and Roman world to come watch and participate in these games. And what Paul is talking about here with discipline, it means that anyone who was going to compete in the games had to train for 10 months. And they had to have record of that in order to actually be able to allow to participate. So discipline, Paul is being serious here. Now, the stadium from the games themselves, there's not much left of the stadium there anymore. So to give you an idea, this is the stadium at Caesarea Maritima in Israel. It's a port city in Israel that you saw some of it on the first slide. Paul would have no doubt seen this. He sailed through the city a couple of times. So you see, I'm actually about halfway through. It's a pretty long stadium. We'd call it a hippodrome now, I think. But there in columns in the center, and you see the platform there is where the ruling official would have sat in the games to watch the games. And so the Corinthians would have been extremely familiar with this image, and I hope this gives us some idea of the stadium Paul is talking about in this verse. And also, I'm a history nerd, so you're always going to get a bit of history with the sermons. I hope this gives us some image of the stadium Paul is talking about. And so Paul's taking this image, this metaphor that the Corinthians would have known well, would have been extremely familiar with. He's saying, hey, you Corinthians, you know the games. You know that in the stadium all the runners run. And so Paul's going to take this image, this metaphor, and use it to explain to the Corinthians in their culture what this Jewish idea of commitment, this Jewish statement of identity of loving God with all your heart means. And so Paul says to these Corinthians who have no passion for God, who are just carried by and distracted by whatever new thing comes along, he says, hey, you Corinthians, you know the games. You know that in the race, all runners run, but only one wins. He says, run like you want to win. Run that you may take hold of the prize. You know how they run for a wreath that wilts and decays. We run for an imperishable crown. Run like you want to win. He says, you say you love God. You say you're Christian, but then you go around pursuing whatever you like, whatever strikes your fancy. You have no passion for God. He's saying, run like you want to win. Run like you want to take hold of the crown. And so Paul uses this metaphor to explain to the Corinthians this Christian life. For Paul, the Christian life is a race. It's a passionate pursuit of God. And for Paul, to be in the race, to be a Christian, means that you can't just be in the race to run. You have to be in the race to win. You have to run with all that you have. To love God with all your heart means that you pursue God with everything you have, your entire focus being aimed at winning the race for God. And so Paul sees these lazy Corinthians. He's basically saying, you love God. If you say you love God, then you better love Him with all your heart. You better pursue Him with everything you have. Run that you may take hold of the prize. Run with passion. He continues in verses 26, he continues the metaphor in 26 and 27. But he turns back to himself as an example. He says, look at me, look at how I run. God gave me the passion for preaching the gospel, and I pursue that with all I have. I run not as one who is aimless, and I box not as one who beats the air. You know what Paul is saying here is that he knows his passion. He knows his focus. He knows the passion that God has placed on his heart to preach the gospel, and he pursues that with an undivided focus and commitment. Therefore, he's not aimless. He's not drawn to just participate in everything that comes along. He pursues his one passion of preaching the gospel with full devotion. And this is how he loves God with all his heart. You know, Paul is speaking to the Corinthians, and I think would say to us that if you want to run well, if you want to run like you want to win, if you want to pursue God with everything you have, don't just pursue everything that comes along, even if they're good works. He says, don't be distracted by anything that you can do, even if they are good things to participate in. He says, know your focus, know your aim, don't be aimless. Know the passion God has given you, and pursue that with full devotion, with a singular focus and purpose. Paul says, look at me, look at when I box. I don't swing as one who beats the air. He's saying I'm disciplined. I know what I can do, and I wait for those moments. Paul's statements here remind me of that scene from Rocky. I think it's Rocky 4. He's fighting the Russian, and he says, I see 3 of them out there. He's told, hit the one in the middle. And that's what Paul is saying here. Paul's saying, I don't swing at everything I see. I don't beat the air. He says, I know what I'm aiming at. I know my focus. I'm disciplined. I keep my focus and my passion directed at this. You know, if we're aiming and just pursuing anything that comes along, even if they are good works for God's kingdom, but if we're just pursuing something until something else comes along, we probably won't accomplish much for God's kingdom. We probably won't be very effective. Paul is saying, focus, know your passion. Know the passion God has placed on your heart, and pursue that with all you have. This is how you love God. You're focused, you're disciplined, you know your aim, you know what you can do. And so Paul says, discern the passion that God has placed on your heart. Discern the passion that rests at the core of your identity, and pursue that with all you have for God's kingdom. And so you see, this is how Paul translates this idea of the Shema, this loving God with all your heart, to the Greek culture of Corinth. He says, it's like a race. To love God with all your heart means that you run with all you have. Run with absolute commitment and focus. Run with passion. Run like you want to win. Run that you may take hold of the prize. And Paul says to do that, to love God with all your heart, to run with passion, you must know your focus. You must know your aim. You must know the passion God has given you for His kingdom. And you must pursue that with a singular purpose and focus. And so this morning, as we seek to write a mission statement for Cross Timbers, I think Paul says to us, he says, discern your passion. Discern your focus. Discern the good work that God has placed on your heart, and pursue that with all you have. Be disciplined, know your aim, and pursue that with a singular purpose and focus. This is how you love God with all your heart. So this morning, as we here at Cross Timbers seek to discover our identity, to learn who we are as the Cross Timbers Church of Christ, as we seek to be those people who love God with all our heart. What is the passion of Cross Timbers? What is the good work God has placed upon our hearts? What troubles and cares in the world keep us up at night? What good work motivates us to get out of bed in the morning? What drives us? What motivates us? What's our passion? What's the good thing God has placed upon our hearts that we can pursue together for His kingdom? So this morning, let us discern our passion. Let us discern the passion God has given us that rests at the corner of our identity, and let us run the race with focus. Let us run with focus the race God has set before us, as together we stand and sing.